May was completely marked by the Himars raids and inflicted hell on the Russian army on the Ukrainian Eastern Front. Himars and Storm Shadow raids caught the Russian forces completely off guard as the Russians prepared for a breakthrough in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian war has long been heavily centered on the eastern axis. The transformation of the war into a struggle of attrition at the operative and strategic levels gave Russia the opportunity to turn its numerical superiority into an advantage in the field of terms of artillery. However, Russia quickly lost this advantage as well. Ukrainian artillery was reinforced with modern Western systems. New weapons included the French Caesar, the German CZ-2000, the Polish Krab, and most importantly, the American Himars M777 and M109 Paladin artillery systems. Especially Caesar and Himars are very difficult artillery systems to detect as they can change positions very quickly. With these systems, which gave the Ukrainian artillery range accuracy and agility, the needle started to turn in favor of Ukraine during the artillery duel phase of the war. Thanks to the new weapons, places such as Snake Island in the Black Sea came within range of the Ukrainian artillery. Himars were also found to be very useful in destroying ammunition depots behind the front lines. The iconic weapon system of this universe was Himars this week. Especially Himars raids marked the clashes on the front. Ukrainian forces wiped out 170 artillery systems and thousands of soldiers of the Russian army on both the southern and eastern fronts. American Himars were mainly used in the Ukrainian attacks. Moscow troops suffer serious casualties as Ukraine begins to make a breakthrough on the front lines. The Ukrainian Army Chief of Staff said in a statement last morning that Russian forces lost 40 artillery systems in the last 24 hours. This is a serious record among the daily losses of the Russian army so far. According to a current count published by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine since May 17, Moscow has lost about 210 artillery systems. During this period, the Russian army also lost more than 100 tanks and hundreds of armored vehicles. In addition, the Russian army lost 31 unmanned aerial vehicles in one day. The Russian army carried out 15 heavy missile and drone attacks on Kiev in May. Ukrainian Air Defense Forces achieved more than 90% success against Russian missile attacks. It launched hundreds of missiles and drones into major airstrikes on Kiev this week. However, the Kiev defense managed to reduce the temperature of 93% of Russian missiles and 96% of UAVs. The number of drones lost since the beginning of the war has increased to 3,000. Besides the losses of unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery, other equipment losses mentioned in the report of the Ukrainian army were also significant. With all these losses, the artillery losses of the Russian army increased to 3,450 and the tank losses to 3,800, while the losses of Russian soldiers reached 210,000. May turned into a nightmare for the Russians, and it was the month of record losses. At the same time, the fate of the war changed completely when the British Storm Shadow missiles were delivered to the Ukrainian army on May 11. Thanks to Storm Shadow, Ukraine was able to target Russian positions, headquarters and arsenals up to 300 kilometers away. Storm Shadow's power was felt, especially in Mariupol, Melitopol, Zaporizhia and Berdyansk regions. Another reason for the significant increase in Russian casualties was certainly the British Storm Shadow missiles. On the other hand, it's not difficult to predict that the war in Ukraine will not end anytime soon. Yet, despite incredible odds, Kiev will face Putin's military machine. At the moment, it's not possible for Ukraine to accept any Russian annexation and loss of territory. Ukrainians will not accept Russia's morbid peace terms to liberate all their legal lands, including Crimea. For this, Ukraine needs more powerful Western technology and modern weapons. Despite the huge losses of the Russian army, Vladimir Putin has not yet put his most powerful troops, war machines and warplanes to the front. However, The fact that the Russian army still has very powerful war machines does not mean that it can win the war, because wars are won with brave soldiers. And this is not the case in Russia. For this to happen, Vladimir Putin would probably have to declare general mobilization. However, this situation will push the Russian Federation to a great stalemate, mass immigration waves, and to ignite a great rebellion. On the other hand, its artillery and supplies have played a crucial role in the war effort conducted by Moscow and Kiev since the outbreak of conflict in February 2022. The U.S. Center for Strategic and International Studies said in January this year that the war in Ukraine has turned into an artillery war. Ukraine has often requested artillery supplies from its Western supporters. The United States has prioritized the supply of artillery in its military aid tranches, including the latest package announced by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin the other day. The Department of Defense stated in a press release that the U.S. will provide 155mm squared and 105mm artillery shells, as well as additional ammunition for the high-motion artillery rocket systems sent to Ukraine. The U.S. Department of Defense stated that as of May 21st, the U.S. has provided more than 161 55mm squared howitzers, 72 105mm squared howitzers, and 38 Himars, in addition to hundreds of mortar systems. Last month, a U.S. think tank, the Institute for War Studies, announced that Russian forces are using artillery to offset their degraded offensive capabilities, especially Russian forces focused on artillery fire in Bakhmut, the eastern stronghold. Russian artillery fire turned the city into a ruin. However, the Ukrainian armed forces shouted to the Russian soldiers and artillery to stop. In early May, the Kiev troops concentrated on counter-offensive operations in Bakhmut. Thus, the advance of the Kiev troops in the city gained momentum. Russian soldiers left their positions and left their wings open. The Ukrainian army glided through these wings into the depths of the city with a determined progress of the Ukrainian armed forces. Part of the city was liberated. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian armed forces said in a statement that the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut repelled Russian forces and recaptured a number of buildings. Kiev troops are holding fortifications and numerous buildings in the southwestern part of the city, according to Sarai Sharavathi, spokesman for the Ukrainian Eastern Forces Group. Also, Ukrainian officials said that the positions around the eastern city of Bakhmut had changed little. Officials noted that the intensity of Moscow's offensive has decreased as Russian regular troops continue to replace Wagner fighters. In another development, Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin appears to have indirectly undermined the authority and regime of the Russian President Vladimir Putin once again. Yevgeny Prigozhin answered a journalist's question about the Russian state media banning any discussion about the Wagner forces. Prigozhin noted that unnamed Russian bureaucrats would be the only ones to benefit from such censorship. In the 1 to 3 months before, the Russian people backed down and started hating the bureaucrats. The Wagner leader noted that if Russia had not started the war in Ukraine, the Russian authorities would have enjoyed their historic ability to censor Russian society. He implied that achieving real successes would allow the officials to avoid lying about the construction of new buildings, subway stations, and bridges in an effort to look good. He shifted the discussion from mentioning anonymous Russian officials to addressing a single man directly. Prigozhin's comments most likely target Putin, whom Russian state media routinely portrays as a leader closely involved with small infrastructure projects and the lives of ordinary Russian people. It seems that the failures on the front lines are straining the relations between Russian authorities. Tensions between Wagner and the official Russian authorities are not easing. The Russia-Ukraine war has intensified in the occupied territories. Russia had to abandon many occupied territories. The Russian army is unable to succeed on the front with untrained soldiers and insufficient ammunition. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is unable to prevent his failure against Ukraine. Developments on the streets of Russia these days show that Putin is now accepting defeat. Russia has shifted from an offensive to a defensive posture on many fronts in the occupied territories, but the recent development shows much more. Russia has started deploying air defense systems on the streets of the capital, Moscow. Thousands of Twitter users from many countries shared images of the deployment of air defense systems on unused buildings on the streets of Moscow. In the images shared as photos and videos, it is seen that Pantsir I air defense systems are deployed on the roofs of abandoned buildings on the streets of Moscow and on the roof of the Russian Defense Ministry's National Defense Management Center building. Putin's move amounts to an acknowledgement of his regression with a recipe because Putin, who has failed in the regions where the war is intense, thinks that the war can spread to his country at any moment. For this reason, he is deploying Russian-made Pantsir I anti-aircraft artillery systems in various parts of the city against a possible Ukrainian air attack. It is rumored that Putin took this precautionary measure after Western European countries announced a military aid package, including long-range weapons, to be sent to the Ukrainian army, allegedly along with the anti-aircraft systems placed on rooftops. Moscow surroundings have also been equipped with massive air defense systems. It is said that S-400 air defense systems have been placed in various parts of the capital since the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian army has shown great success in the occupied territories. Putin, on the other hand, has tried to cover up his failure by attacking civilian areas and infrastructure. The Ukrainian army is very careful not to attack civilians. Ukrainian President Zelensky has often said that the difference between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army is in targeting civilians. Since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian army has successfully struck several military air bases and military airfields in Russia. These include Engels Military Airfield in the Saratov region and the Akulovo Military Airfield in the city of Ryazan. The Ukrainian Air Force had already reached Russian territory bypassing the occupation zones. Ukrainian kamikaze drones bombed an oil facility in Novokirkivsk Rostov region, the largest oil refinery in southern Russia. Likewise, 2 Ukrainian helicopters crossed the Russian border, flew 40 kilometers on notice, and hit warehouses belonging to a Russian oil company. The missile attack on the Russian city of Belgorod also shows that the Ukrainian army has crossed the Russian border many times. So why is Putin making such a move now by deploying anti-aircraft, missile and artillery systems on the streets of Russia? Putin has admitted that he has reached the final point because the Russian army is losing every day against Ukraine. Russia has lost over 120,000 soldiers less than a year into the war. Even the mandatory mobilization orders announced can't solve this problem. Russian youths do not want to fight, and the Russian people are increasing their street protests against the occupation every day. Putin has also lost hundreds of thousands of ammunition during the war. The successful operations of the Ukrainian army's air and ground forces, which destroyed Russian military bases and ammunition depots, show that Russia is in a state of irrecoverable decline. Russian leader Putin has failed to solve all these problems. His failure is now evident in the withdrawal of troops from the front, unarmed and without ammunition. Putin fears that the war will spread to the streets of Russia in the face of the Russian army's retreat and the Ukrainian army's excellent advice. That's why the city is being equipped with anti-aircraft air systems. Russia has no presence in the regions where the war is raging. The war is currently raging in the eastern regions of Ukraine, in the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. In the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar in this region, the Ukrainian troops are riding an epic against the Russian invaders. The Russian army, on the other hand, has many problems within itself. In the past days, soldiers of the Russian private military company Wagner Group operating in the occupied territories announced that they had captured the city of Soledar, but soon after, a statement came from the Kremlin. The separate statements of the Russian army and Wagner Group soldiers caused controversy. There are many different units in the Russian army. Among these units, The Wagner Group and Kadyrov soldiers have been on the agenda since the beginning of the war. The mercenaries belonging to the Wagner Group company are unaware that they are fighting for company owner Yevgeny Prigozhin's school of seizing the salt mines and underground resources in the city of Salado. Chechen soldiers loyal to Chechnya's unpopular President Kadyrov are on the front line because Putin holds Kadyrov's office. Meanwhile, soldiers of the Russian armed forces, on the other hand, are forced to fulfill their military service, unaware that they are fighting for Putin's political ambition and reputation. In short, not all Russian troops are volunteers and violent soldiers. This is causing Russia to lose more and more day by day. It is also stated that these units of the Russian army cannot agree among themselves. The soldiers belonging to the Wagner Group do not listen to the commanders of the Russian army. Chechen troops loyal to Kadyrov are humiliated because of their race. This turmoil within the army is preparing the end of Russia. The recent dismissal of Sergei Surovikin, the commander in charge of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, proves that Russia is exhausted. The Ukrainian army is making history with its successes against Russia. Zelensky is united with his army and his people. As the war intensifies, the resistance of the Ukrainian people is getting stronger. In contrast to the problems in the Russian army, the Ukrainian army is united with all its units against the invaders. Soldiers of the Azov Battalion, of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, and the Kraken Regiment of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine have carried out spectacular operations in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions where the war is raging. These units are made up of the most experienced soldiers serving in the Ukrainian army. After the loss of Crimea in 2014, the Ukrainian army has paid great attention to their work. The Azov Battalion and the Kraken Regiment were formed after the loss of Crimea at the beginning of the Russian occupation. The Ukrainian army placed its most experienced soldiers and commanders in these battalions. Both battalions played a major role in the Ukrainian army is adverse against the invaders. In the new year, the war intensified in the shadow of reshuffles, explosions, gains and losses. The Ukrainian army, with the support of Western and European countries, continues to strengthen its army day by day. The Russian army, on the other hand, is on the decline due to sanctions, troop and ammunition shortages, and other unfavorable developments. Russia has lost almost 70% of the territory it occupied in Ukraine. Zelensky is also trying to take Crimea, annexed by Russian occupiers in 2014 from the Russians in the new year. The Russian-Ukrainian war is expected to become more heated. We will continue to bring you all new developments in the war zones. Why do you think Russia has placed anti-aircraft systems on the streets of Moscow? Will Putin be able to solve the problems of troops, ammunition, and units in the Russian army? How do you interpret the successes of the Ukrainian army? The biggest news once again comes from the north. Here, Russian forces failed to return full control over the Russian territories during the first day, and the fighting carried over into the next day. By morning, the situation did not change much. After 12 hours of continuous fighting, Russian forces reportedly only managed to advance a little bit in the northern part of Goropodol, while the resistance forces assumed positions in the southern part of the settlement. Local residents posted multiple videos of artillery strikes and the aftermath of shelling. Time worked against Russians because the longer it took Russians to push the resistant forces back, the more they managed to build and equip defensive fortifications in the rear. As can be seen from the geolocated video of the Russian control point, the footage shows that the region backs with sand from the control point to block the roads and create defensive points. After noon, the insurgent forces reportedly started retreating from Grayvarin, and the Russian Ministry of Defense soon declared that the counter-terrorist operation was completed and all saboteurs were destroyed. It turned out that the head of the counter-terrorist operation was the notorious General Lapin, who lost all territories under his responsibility in the aftermath of the second Ukrainian counter-offensive in the Kharkiv region. The video showed how he marched on the main road leading his forces into the battle. This raised concerns in the Russian media space as Lapin is not perceived as a competent leader. A few hours later, it became clear that the operation was not over. Local residents continued publishing videos with audible gunfire and explosions. Later, a soldier from the Russian forces reported that Ukrainians were still controlling Kazanka, Glovo, and the control point. He said that the resistance was immense and they lacked the forces and support to recapture the settlements. He claimed that the insurgent forces were firing at Russian forces from tanks, mortars, and artillery. Geolocated footage confirmed the claims of the Russian soldiers showing mortar positions in Kazanka. The insurgent forces reportedly had at least 5 times the amount of support as Russian forces and were also reinforced by around 500 more troops. Simultaneously, local residents started reporting that the Freedom of Russia Legion entered the Belgorod region from the south as well. It was reported that Ukrainians conducted an artillery preparation and struck objects in the vicinity of Bogun, Gorodok, Lozovaya, Rutka, and Karpovka. Later, sabotage groups reportedly entered Gorkovsky, Bogun, Gorodok, and Turnovka and started moving northwest, possibly to close the gap and effectively establish control over at least 300 kilometers squared of the Belgorod region. According to Russian sources, Russian Rapid Deployment Forces, frontier police, and regular forces were deployed to prevent any further expansion of the insurgent forces. Russian military analysts got worried about the escalation of the situation because Ukrainians reportedly have created at least 3 areas of visible forces concentrations around the Belgorod region. 500 troops near Velika Pisarivka, 2,000 troops near Udi, and 2,000 troops near Lipetsky. So it looks like the insurgent forces initially retreated not because they were defeated. They retreated for 3 reasons. Firstly, they were joined Russian forces on themselves. Secondly, they finished preparing their defense in order to conduct this operation and the Russian forces without damage to themselves. And thirdly, they received a reinforcement to hold the line tightly. The insurgent forces revealed the biggest current vulnerability of the Russian army. Russians simply do not have any reserves left because all of them have already been deployed to the front. That is why they were forced to use rapid deployment forces from the Federal Security Service, which did not work very well because firstly, they do not have heavy equipment such as artillery. And secondly, yesterday's drone strike successfully hit the Department of Federal Security Service in Belgrade, which likely caused disarray. Today's footage clearly shows that the drones hit the parking lot and also penetrated the building. The head of the Freedom of Russia Legion reported that those reserves the Russians managed to scramble, namely a motorized rifle company, were destroyed and Russians started deploying new forces. The latest Russian reports once again claimed that the insurgent forces retreated and Russians returned control over the region. However, even if it is true, they seem to have accomplished their mission because Russians started relocating their forces from the front. Ukrainian intelligence reported that Russians started redeploying their forces from Ukraine to the Belgorod region. Russian military analysts confirmed this information and specified that the Russian military leadership decided to deploy the 74th Motorized Rifle Brigade to the Belgorod region border area in order to counter the current attacks and prevent future ones. And this is a very favorable development for Ukrainians because it relieves the fronts and also diminishes the number of available Russian reserves. Reserves is the decisive factor in a successful defensive operation because they are used to prevent a total collapse after the first line of defense is breached. The decreasing number of enemy reserves significantly increases the chances of a successful counter-offensive operation.